Okay, so hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Book Cafe podcast. In today's episode, we will be talking about this book right here behind me entitled The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. And I'm extremely excited to have the author himself in today's episode to talk about the book. But just before we begin, if you're watching this on YouTube, do please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. And if you're listening to this on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or Spotify, do please continue to support the show and continue to download because we're going to have a lot of great content coming up very soon. So let's get this particular episode underway. So without further ado, let me first introduce the author himself, Professor Dr. Craig Considine. Hi, Craig. Welcome to Book Cafe podcast.
Greetings. Thank you for having me.
So thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us on the show. I've been a huge fan of yours for many years now, and this really is a pleasure to be able to talk to you directly. Now, Professor, we will of course get to talking about your book in a minute, but before that, for our viewers and listeners who may not have read the book yet and who might be discovering you for the very first time, do please take this moment to tell us just a little bit more about yourself, specifically with regards to your education background, your ethnic and cultural background, and in fact, anything at all that you'd like to share with us.
Great. Omar, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to meet you face to face after many online exchanges. So thank you so much. So I suppose my journey really begins in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts. I'm from Needham, and my father, his ancestry, of course, my name Considine comes from Western Ireland in a place called Lisdoonvarna, County Clare. And my mother, who grew up in Boston, is the grandchild of immigrants from Italy. So I often joke with folks, even though my dad wasn't particularly Catholic, as a Irish and Italian American, I kind of had little choice but to fall into this category of Catholic. But my upbringing was very rich, proud Bostonians. We loved sports. Very much into especially Italian food culture and everything that comes with that, with big families. And my dad always instilled in me a pride for being from Ireland and what that meant. We could have a whole podcast for something like that. The meaning and the strength of Irish identity. So I grew up going to public school, but I also went to Catholic school. So I was reared in the Catholic faith. And the suburb that I grew up in Needham, was, being from Boston, it's a pretty intellectual environment. In general, the education is quite strong, but we didn't particularly have a lot of diversity. We had multiple Christian denominations. We were obviously Catholic. We had 2 temples in town, Jewish temples, which is pretty significant, actually. A lot of other parts of the country in the United States, you won't even see synagogues. So when 9/11 happened, I was 15.
Right.
And we had, and I guess I'm saying this on behalf of people like me who grew up in my town, like we really had little, if any, context to properly make sense of what had happened on that day. And it wasn't just the atrocious, inhumane act of killing innocent people, but it was also the fallout from the media. This is a time, early 2000s, the media is just getting going and becoming more and more powerful. So all these messages were being delivered to us in the media. And again, with little to no context to make sense of it. And I don't just mean like intellectual context through education. I also mean human to human encounters. We had no mosques in town. I think we may have had a couple of Muslims in my high school, and it was a pretty big high school. So I'm also a product of my age. So I'm 37 now, but at the time of 2001, I was 15. When the invasion of Iraq happened, I was a freshman in college, and there was a lot of questions brewing at this time, not just about Islam, but also about the so-called Muslim world. So I became quite interested in the developments of my time, the happening of my time, and I decided to uh, quit basketball because I was a basketball player previously, and I decided to commit myself to scholarship. So I transferred to DC. I went to Washington, and I enrolled at American University in DC with the intention of getting into some type of intelligence agency. Like I wanted to figure out why something like 9/11 happened. So to do that, I started taking courses on Islam, and I was taking Arabic classes. And very quickly, in the first Islam class I took, it was called World of Islam 101 with Professor Akbar Ahmed at American. And very quickly, I had realized that the stuff that was in my head and in my heart was not, let's say, reflective of reality, but I also sensed that it wasn't healthy, that I had kind of been, not brainwashed per se, like I was never completely brainwashed, but I knew something was up, and I trusted Dr. Ahmed. I trusted what he was saying. And he was also emphasizing the importance of interfaith. So when I started this journey that I just explained, like it was about intelligence, it was about international relations and government and all this. And then the interfaith realm came. And I said, this is it. This is the perfect solution, the perfect remedy for a lot of the division that we see in the world. So that was the foundation of my educational background. I then went on to pursue a master's degree at the University of London, Royal Holloway. That was a very transformative year for me. I had never been outside of the United States, didn't have a passport, had to do all that stuff to actually study there. And for the first time in my life, Omar, I was the other, I was the American. Mm-hmm. And this is at a time of heightened anti-American sentiment. It was about 2008. So when I get to London, which is an ally of the United States, you would think a lot of people were just like, what is happening in your country? Like, what did you do? So that was quite interesting and informative. And then after that, I went to do my PhD in Ireland, Dublin, Ireland. And I'm happy to talk more about that maybe later with that book. But that's a very brief overview of my journey. That's not necessarily my beliefs per se, and of course we change over time, but that is essentially the foundation of where I'm at now.
Absolutely. Well, Professor, thank you so much for sharing that. And one of the things I really liked about the book was, it's entitled The Humanity of Muhammad, but you did start the book by telling us about yourself and your background, coming out of Boston and joining American University, and your professor, Dr. Akbar Ahmed. He said a line that really changed your worldview about Islam, which till that time you only had the media to look to, to tell you about Islam. But when you took that class, I believe you mentioned that he quoted a hadith that said, "The ink of a scholar is holier than the blood of a martyr," and that must have been, it must have felt like an epiphany. Can you tell us a little bit more about that first day, that first class that you had with Dr. Akbar Ahmed?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought this up. So when I got to Dr. Ahmed, I was 19. I was a sophomore. And I had only begun this journey of having interest in scholarship and in knowledge. As I said, I was a basketball player. I decided to completely shift and put all my energy into studying. So I was already on the journey of being fascinated by acquiring, wisdom, if you want to call it that, knowledge. And then I get to Dr. Ahmed, and I'm thinking, again, the first class is going to be about Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. And he starts off by sharing multiple hadith on how Prophet Muhammad emphasized the importance of knowledge. So not only was I kind of rocked in my head, I said, wow, so he's connecting Islam to knowledge and Islam not to Al-Qaeda. So he was doing that intellectually. And that just really that moved me. But I also became quite interested in how he approached the actual term knowledge. What is knowledge, right? It's not just the peer-reviewed journal articles and the books. It's what you can acquire in conversation and in dialogue with other people. So that, to me, like the combination of those two things could do wonders. And I was convinced quite early that this was part of the solution. So it's I'm very lucky as well. Let me explain here. Very lucky to have had Dr. Ahmed as my teacher and not someone who was on, let's say, a different wavelength, right? So someone who was looking more at security or terrorism. I could have easily gone down that road, but he emphasized interfaith.
Right.
And to me, that was just not only interesting intellectually, but it also suited me as a person, because I like to talk to people. I like to engage. I like to spend time with people, learn from people, grow with people, create friendships with people. So I'm lucky. As we were saying before we started this, the luck of the Irish, I guess, applies.
Yes, absolutely. The luck of the Irish. And obviously, listening to you and having read the way you've credited Dr. Akbar Ahmed in the book, I can only imagine if it was some other professor, your destiny or your life may have
Yeah.
been very different from what it is right now. So yes, we do have, Dr. Akbar Ahmed to thank for the role that he's played in your life. Okay, so Professor, moving on to the book itself, after that amazing introduction. As I said, that the book is entitled "The Humanity of Muhammad: A Christian View." And for our viewers and listeners who haven't had the chance of reading the book yet, can you tell us what the book is about?
So it is a sociological analysis of Prophet Muhammad's life and legacy. That's what it is in short. And the chapters are quite short. It's actually quite a short book as well. It's very concise. And I focus on several themes, and these are the sociological themes. I look at how Prophet Muhammad lived his life in relation to religious pluralism, in relation to anti-racism, in relation to civic nation building, in relation to women's rights, in relation to knowledge, and this idea of the golden rule: treat others how you wish to be treated.
Right.
So this is not a book. While it engages in theology and religious studies in general, it really looks at powerful moments in his life that shows us like this human connection, this human touch. So it's not about the claims that he was making as a prophet. It's about how he treated people. So I dive into specific relationships that he had with people, whether it's an individual or a community. So I look at, for example, in anti-racism, I look at the relationship that he had with Bilal ibn Rabah. In the religious pluralism, I look at the relationship that he built with the Christians of Najran. So really looking at his life as a way to create, these are historical stories, of course, but to communicate them in a contemporary light, a sociological light, away from religious dogma and some of these, massive theological claims that people can make. So it's an accessible book. I would say that. I think even like a high school or secondary degree reader would be able to digest. And of course, the book doesn't just focus on Muhammad. Of course, it looks at his legacy. So, how have people taken what he had given through his example, but also through his teachings, and how did they move through into future generations? So basically, how did future Muslims and Christians, for that matter, reflect what and how he had lived in his life? So I look at things like, I look at the legacy of, for example, Al-Andalus, this, multiple century long rule in Western Europe. A lot of people always forget that Islam has largely always been part of Europe. Right. But looking at these moments where Christians and Muslims are coming together, emphasizing knowledge, they're not putting identity as the marker of human interaction. It's about progress. It's about making this world a better place. And it just so happened that there was a diverse group of people there, and they made it work. And I think that's what Muhammad would have wanted, right? Just progress, human progress. Let's maximize our potential. I mean, I think that he was a man of excellence in every life. I mean, most Muslims would certainly agree with that. But he was good at everything. He was an excellent person, and I think that standard is needs to be kept high.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. And it's nice that you mentioned Al-Andalus or Andalusia as we know it in history. And I think that a lot of the times that particular empire or civilization only lasted for about 700 years, and hence the reason why it probably gets forgotten when it comes to Islamic history. And but it is definitely one of my favorite times in history. That I absolutely love that particular time period. And of course, one can't forget that the greatest Jewish philosopher of the time, Rabbi Maimonides, was a product of Andalusian culture. And of course, we will definitely touch on that as we go forward with this episode. But circling back, Professor, to what you mentioned right at the beginning of the answer to this question, you mentioned religious pluralism, and you also compared it with religious tolerance in the book, right? So, for our viewers and listeners, who may not know the distinction between religious tolerance and religious pluralism, would you be able to help us define these two terms? What is meant by these two particular terms?
Sure. So I take my lead from Diana Eck, Professor Eck at Harvard University, the Harvard Pluralism Project.
Mhm.
And Professor Eck actually maybe I don't know if Professor Eck was deliberately doing this, but she put a sociological spin on the term pluralism. And I think before she established this principle, which I'll explain in a second, pluralism, I think, was generally regarded as this idea that like all religions are equal. Like there's 100 religions in the world and like they're equally valid. It's like a very secular way of looking at religion. Like everything is just equal.
Right.
And that can be very, that can put people off because it makes them kind of sacrifice their religion. Like everything has to be equal. So Professor Eck is not saying that. And I like that. Professor Eck is saying that religious pluralism is more something that we as humans can operationalize with our energy and our bodies. Mm-hmm. So Eck is saying that religious pluralism is the energetic engagement with religious diversity. That is like the primary component, I think, of Professor Eck's definition. So it's energetic engagement. Now, energetic engagement, if you juxtapose that to tolerance, they're two totally different things. Now, to have that energetic engagement, you have to have tolerance. But if you only have tolerance, then what is actually moving forward? Are we moving forward, actually? Because tolerance is very standoffish, right? Like, Omar, if I tolerate something that you do in your life, or you tolerate something I do, and you're not okay with it, and it's like, like there's like a little disconnect, but we just kind of tolerate it. I mean, that's one human example, but as religious communities, if we merely tolerate each other, we're actually having no type of cross-cultural communication. So everyone under the banner of tolerance is just allowed to exist as they do, with no interaction. And that can lead to problems. That can lead to stereotypes. And then let's say something happens in the world, the media picks it up. All of a sudden, let's say a Jewish community is in the news. If no one knows anything about their Jewish neighbors because of this tolerance that established like a status quo, you could have negative views of those people. But if you know these people, like actually know these people, right? They're your neighbors. They don't just live next to you. They're your neighbors. Different story. You engage with them. You have conversations with them. This can lead, in theory, to stronger social relations, tighter social harmony, general sense of better well-being. In short, what we're talking about with pluralism is just moving beyond this like let's just accept people in the name of diversity. It's more of like, what do we do with this diversity? Let's actually mix, let's mingle, let's get to know one another. And that's what Muhammad did. I mean, I can speak about that for eons.
Yeah, absolutely. And with yes, and absolutely. And in keeping with religious pluralism, Professor, I think that you gave two amazing examples in the book, which I think a lot of Muslims, the average Muslim, may not even be very aware of unless they've really studied history. And I'm saying that as a avid student of history, that a lot of people may or may not know about it. But let's touch on those 2 points. In the book, you gave the example of the first hijrah, where the Muslims of Mecca at the time, who were under persecution, were sent to a neighboring country. And the second example you gave of the Prophet's advocacy for religious pluralism was when he invited the Christians of Najran to come and visit him in his abode in Medina. So, would you be able to tell us a little bit more, Professor, about the first hijrah in 615 CE and the delegation from Najran that visited him in the year 631 CE? You please go ahead.
Sure. So, yeah, 615. This is 5 years after the revelations began. Muhammad goes public in 613 with the revelations. So they were underground for approximately 3 years.
Yeah.
After 2 years, Muhammad is so successful, really, in bringing people into the boat that the power players in Meccan society, who happen to be his own family, his own clan and tribe, the Hashim and Quraysh, they become intimidated by him, right? He's a threat to their power. So what do? They stir things up and they make sure that some of his community members are feeling that oppression and that discrimination. So Muhammad makes a decision knowing full well that his community is not doing well and that his community might not even survive. So he tells them, and this is like miraculous. This story still blows my mind. So he tells a group of his closest people to travel from Mecca to the coast, the coast of the Arabian Peninsula, get on a boat across the Red Sea and land in a Christian kingdom where they would be protected. So that's a huge leap of faith. Like not only making the physical journey, right? They had a long journey, and I assume that the companions were not familiar with Abyssinia. I don't. Maybe some of them had gone previously, but I'm not sure. So yeah, that's incredible. The fact that Muhammad had faith and confidence in the Christian king to take care of them, and I'll speak about that in a second, but also the companions they believed so much in Muhammad and they trusted him so much that they said, okay, this is a good idea. Now, thankfully, the story, according to the sources, is a good one. King Ibn Abjar had not only, in short, again, we could spend an hour just talking about this one scene in King Ibn Abjar's court. But in short, he gave the early Muslim community the opportunity to build a bridge. So they were sharing verses of the Quran to King Ibn Abjar, so making that connection between Christians and Muslims. But as we know in the historical sources as well, the Quraysh are following the Muslims to Aksum, the capital of Abyssinia. And the goal in doing so was basically to convince the Christian king to hand over the Muslims back to the Quraysh. The Quraysh would basically put them on that boat, cross the Red Sea, bring them back to Mecca, either imprisoned or put to death, probably one of the two. And King Ibn Abjar said, absolutely not. He said, not going to do it. He said, even for a mountain of gold, I wouldn't give these people up to you. So that is a form of pluralism, right? It is like, so King Ibn Abjar was tolerant to begin with, to allow them to even be there, tolerant to allow them to speak openly about the Quran and what it says. So that's tolerant in itself. But he actively defended them.
Mhm.
So he put his own empire and his nation's well-being on the line for a stranger community. That's basically what it was. So in other works that I've developed, I talk about the concept of allyship and how the Christians were very strong allies, at least in Abyssinia, to the early Muslim community. Now, the Christians of Najran happens quite a good deal later, 15, 16 years later. The situation is much different. The early Ummah, led by Prophet Muhammad, was establishing itself as not only a kind of domestic around Medina, Mecca, ruler in this area, but more of like a regional player. I think Muhammad probably saw the writing on the wall and figuring that they were going to be successful and they were going to be a nation. So he was reaching out to all the regional leaders, and many of them were Christian. This is another thing that people often forget about Muhammad's life. Like there was a lot, not only a lot of Christians around, but there was a lot of Christian diversity around, because obviously Christianity is not a monolith. So the Christians of Najran are coming from modern day southern Saudi Arabia, northern Yemen. And I write in a different book, Omar, which I think you've read as well, People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. The Christians of Najran were very likely, yeah, there you go, very likely Trinitarians, right? So like there's often this thing that I see on social media where critics of my work will be like, well, Prophet Muhammad only wanted to work with like Unitarian Christians, or like only the Christians that would reject the Trinity, as a way of kind of safeguarding the pure monotheism of Islam. But I've argued elsewhere that no, he was engaging with Christians across the board. So the Christians of Najran, Trinitarians, I think, are welcomed by Muhammad. Muhammad sends them a letter. Again, he's growing his empire, and they arrive to Medina, to Masjid al-Nabawi, right? That the center, the very heart of Islam at the time. And there are several highlights here. Number one, actually, there's three. The first, and perhaps the most important, is that it lasted for 3 days, which means that they had to have at least a certain degree of not only tolerance, but also some general amicability, if I could use that term, right? So like there had to be some type of good environment, good charm involved. So that's a good sign. We also know via early Islamic sources that the early Ummah, the Muslims, and the Christians of Najran had engaged in what is imaginably like a pretty significant and in-depth conversation on Christology, the nature of Jesus Christ. And the sources say that the Christians spoke openly, right? So again, you have this tolerance. People are able to speak openly. That's great. I mean, that's the least we can do, right? But Muhammad was also like engaging with them, like, explain to me the Trinity. Like, what do you mean? Maybe saying something like, I don't totally understand how it's pure monotheism. So they were grappling. They were going back and forth, and imagine that it's civil, right? It's like a civil discourse, and they agreed to disagree. Essentially, that's civility. That's so critically important, and he knew that. But the third point here is that the Christians of Najran were allowed to pray inside the Masjid al-Nabawi, which is still, even to this day, if you think about it, pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
Not only for Muslims to allow Christians to pray, but for Christians to allow Muslims to pray in their church, right? I mean, it's a big deal. And Muhammad, in doing this, he was doing multiple things. I think one was showing that these are our Christian brothers in faith and spirit. I mean, they're very close to Islam and Christianity. But I think more importantly, Muhammad was trying to leave a lesson for his people, his followers. And that lesson was that you should treat people with the golden rule, how they want to be treated.
Right.
And that you should always be hospitable. because these Christians of Najran were going to go pray outside, and that would have been messy. It would have been a hassle. It's a foreign land. They don't know what the weather might be or something like that. And Muhammad says, like, you're already here. You're in a place of God. Just you can have this space and do it.
Correct.
So I think that's extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just profound. I mean, the way that the Prophet had treated the Christian delegation in 631, and the fact that he had so much faith in the Abyssinian king to be able to send his followers there in the first Hijrah in 615 CE. In fact, a lot of lay Muslims, I would say that probably aren't as aware of the first Hijrah as they are with the second one from 622 when the calendar dates. And so, yeah. I really wanted to make it a point to highlight just these two events, just to show exactly how much appreciation there was between these two religious communities at the time. And if memory serves me right, Professor, even after the death of the Prophet, when when the whole of Arabia came under Muslim administration, as did Persia, as did North Africa and Spain eventually, I can recall that there was so much respect that the Muslims had for the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia that they never once entertained any thoughts of trying to go over there and try and administer it or impose themselves on it. So that really does show exactly how much mutual respect there was. So staying with Abyssinia, Professor, and let's talk about one of the Prophet's intimate companions. And his name is obviously Bilal, the first muezzin, or the one who gave the call to prayer. And of course, it's speculated that he most probably came from Abyssinia, which is now modern-day Ethiopia. And at the time, Arabian society was probably quite racist, but you made it a point in the book to highlight the Prophet's stance against racism. You call it anti-racism as opposed to being a non-racist. Would you be able to try and define these two terms? What you mean by somebody who's a non-racist versus somebody who's an anti-racist?
Sure. So it's quite similar in many ways to the tolerance versus pluralism thing. So tolerance is a good thing, but it's standoffish. It doesn't ask you or require you to do anything except a general kind of acceptance or status quo. And non-racism is quite similar. It's a good thing. To be a non-racist is a good thing. Probably want more of those type of people in the world. But it's also just that. It's just someone who holds these kind of these views, which are good, egalitarian, democratic, however you might want to put it. But with pluralism, it's energetic. With anti-racism versus non-racism, again, it's energetic. That word anti suggests maybe that someone is working towards combating something, right? It takes effort, to engage, to alleviate that social problem. So Muhammad was both, but again, striving more towards the how can we actually push back against racism rather than just condemn it. There's two different things. Like you can condemn it with words or actually try to liberate people. And that's what he did with Bilal. He literally did it. He worked to purchase Bilal's freedom. But more importantly, and I'm not even sure, Omar, you might know better than me. I'm not even sure if I wrote this in the book, but I often say this now in talks. Like the best thing that Muhammad did for Bilal was not just merely freeing him, ending the shackles on his wrists, cutting those off, but Muhammad worked to create a society and a community that allowed someone like Bilal to maximize his potential. Yeah. The differences between those two levels is huge. Right. And I'll give you an example, even from the American perspective, like Civil War, right? So Civil War ends in 1865. Right. The slaves are already free, but now they're like really free, right? Within a larger country. And then you see Reconstruction happen. Right. So like they're free, but all these things are put into place to keep them down. Right. So Muhammad had an understanding for like the bigger picture. that it's not just enough to say, let's get this person out of a bad situation. Instead, he's saying, yes, let's get them out of a bad situation, but let's actually make sure that they're moving forward and that they're being successful and that they can maximize their potential.
Right.
So that's why he's a great leader, because he's not just ending something like, slavery.
Yeah,
Or
correct.
just condemning it. He's allowing people to maximize their potential, and that's so important.
Absolutely. And I think that you've really you made a very wonderful comparison here, Professor, because, as you rightly said, that this American Civil War ended in 1865, but it still took another 100 years, and the political activism of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X to really try and get full civil rights for people of color in the U.S. And with regards to the Prophet and Bilal, he didn't wait for Bilal's people to wait another 100 years to get full rights. He did it instantly and helped him grow. And I think that's a really interesting comparison that you've made. So, in keeping with that, Professor, one of the most interesting comparisons you've made in the book is how you've made, the comparison between Islamic culture and American culture. I'm talking about the civil, not the civil rights, the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, and you've taken American values and you've juxtaposed it with Islamic values. And you've also alluded to the fact that somebody like George Washington and Ben Franklin would have definitely endorsed a lot of things that the Prophet Muhammad did. Would you be able to just touch a little bit upon that? George Washington, Ben Franklin, and the Prophet Muhammad, and how you've managed to link
Yeah.
them together.
So a shout out and thanks here to Dr. Ahmed again, having a good teacher, alerting me to the strength of a pluralist vision of America, right? So America is going to mean something different to everyone, but like there might be kind of broad spectrums that we can clump people into. So Dr. Ahmed was saying that America is at its best when it has a pluralist vision. So you read something like the Declaration of Independence, like we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men, human beings, are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that is very neutral. Anyone can get into that. And that, in addition to a lot of other things like the Constitution, like this enables the universe, the world, to find themselves in America. And when this country is at its best, it's that. Now, I would say the same with Islamic civilization, if I could throw that out there as a whole. It has a pluralist vision.
Right.
And my work is literally showing Muhammad's pluralist vision, in engaging in the Constitution of Medina. I mean, the Quran itself is a universal book, talking about the people of the book and the reverence that it has for Christians and Jews. So that alone, like that kind of language in the Declaration of Independence, matches up, I think, quite well with really foundational, basic Islamic values of equality, of justice, but also of not necessarily compassion, but like egalitarian. Like anyone can be brought in. Like even the Constitution of Medina, 622. Like, how would a scholar interpret the Ummah through the Constitution of Medina? Is the Ummah only Muslim, or is the Ummah a nation, multicultural, multi-religious? So that's a big picture thing there. Like, we can make, as scholars, we can make the comparison that there's a pluralist vision of America and that there's a pluralist vision of Islam. However, you could also focus on other models too, right? So America has a darker side. Islamic civilization can have a darker side, but I guess the question is like, why would we stress too much emphasis on those categories of national identity that divide us, rather than looking at the more pluralist vision that encourages people to get to know one another. So that's an interesting thing. Now, with the founding fathers, fascinating group of people, arguably one of the most extraordinary generations in quite some time. So they were products of the Enlightenment. They were for freedom of religion, rationality, small government, power to the people, voting, human rights. Now, again, we could spend a whole session on problematizing slavery, which should be problematized, and other anti-immigration waves that the United States has had throughout history. But there is plenty of information, primary sourced information, writings from Washington, writings from Franklin, writings from Jefferson, that actually show and demonstrate that they imagined Muslims to be part of America down the road. So that term imagined was developed by Denise Spellberg, professor at University of Texas in Austin, Texas, the capital, which isn't 4 hours. It's about 4 hours from Houston. So Professor Spellberg is saying that they imagined Muslims as future citizens, and that makes sense. So someone like Franklin, a man of the world, brilliant mind, diplomat, extraordinaire, astronomer, scientist, inventor. There's one quote that is attributed to him, and it's actually before the revolution started, and he was living in Philadelphia at the time. Now, by the way, Franklin is from where I'm from, Boston, but he fled Boston because they were too puritanical. It was the Puritans. So these are like your modern day fundamentalists, your Wahhabi, Salafi type people, like very, very rigid, very. So Ben Franklin said, "I'm out. I'm getting out of here." Goes to Philadelphia. Philadelphia was part of Pennsylvania. William Penn, who was the founder of the state of Pennsylvania, was all for religious tolerance. So Franklin is like, this place is great. There's all these different religions here. We can all make sense of this. We can all be American. Now, the quote I was saying that's attributed to him, he said something like this: if the Mufti, actually, he literally said this, if the Mufti of Constantinople, those are the literal words, which is modern day Istanbul, if that Mufti wanted to come to Philadelphia to preach, not to speak politically or diplomatically, but to actually preach his religion, which is basically to get you to convert and proselytize. Franklin was saying they should be able to do that in this city. And he was referring explicitly to a hall. He was trying to fundraise for like a secular hall. And he was dealing with opposition. People were like, well, it should only be a Christian hall so we can welcome Christian denominations. Franklin was saying Hindus, Buddhists, whoever, Muslims, bring them over. Now, Washington is an interesting case, because Washington, and I've written about this, it wasn't in The Humanity of Muhammad, but Washington had a relationship, very good friendship with someone named Sambo Anderson. And I've written a Huffington Post article about this. Have you seen this, Omar? Have you seen my work on this?
No, I have not, but I would love to know a bit more about it.
Yeah, so Sambo was George Washington's like right hand man. He was enslaved, but he was basically a free man, but categorically a slave.
Okay.
And I wrote this article, which I think helped to prove that Sambo was either a Muslim or a generation removed from people who were Muslim. And he was part of the Hausa tribe in West Africa, in modern day West Africa. And I talk about how he might have a Muslim identity.
Right.
So the founding fathers are really, really extraordinary.
Remarkable. Yeah, absolutely.
Had their faults. I think if I can be blunt, I think they realized that they wouldn't be able to create the country that they wanted to create if the slavery issue was disbanded. And they made a very unfortunate, in hindsight, I wouldn't say unfortunate, but like they made the decision to keep this institution around for the sake of creating a country. And of course, America dealt with that and still is dealing with that.
Correct, correct, absolutely. Well, Professor, thank you so much for that comparison. And obviously, when it comes to American politicians and founding fathers, Ben Franklin is definitely my favorite because he was such a
Yeah.
polymath. And what a remarkable man. And I actually did read a little bit of his biography, but I was very familiar with him for most of my life. So Walter Isaacson wrote a phenomenal
Yes.
biography on American life. I think you have it there, right? Okay.
I think I have it at home. I have this one by
Yeah.
Morgan,
Okay.
Edmund
Oh,
Morgan, but I have the Isaacson one at home.
oh, it's a fabulous
Little
read.
little secret guests here. Wisdom of
Thomas
Thomas
Jefferson.
Jefferson. These all happen to just be here.
That's amazing.
Interesting.
And in
Yes.
fact, Professor, I don't think you mentioned Thomas Jefferson in the book, but I believe that he also owned a copy of the Quran, and he was actually the one who said that he can definitely see Muslims as American citizens at some point. Is that correct? Would that be right?
That is. Yep. So there's a statue at the University of Virginia, which is the university that he founded in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Right.
And there's a statue of him holding a tablet of religious freedom. And on that tablet is written God in all these different languages, Allah's one. So
Mm.
Jefferson, a couple of big things with him. He did own the Quran. It
Mm.
was written by George Sale in 1731. Interesting analysis from other scholars coming out about that actual interpretation. It's an actual translation, and they're saying, Sale may have been letting his anti-Muslim kind of sentiment seep in.
Mm.
So Jefferson got a translation of the Quran, but that was the one that he got. Now
Okay.
this Quran, interestingly, is housed in the Library of Congress in Washington.
Right.
And in 2000 and maybe 5 or 6,
Mhm.
Representative Keith Ellison from Minnesota in the United States took his oath of allegiance
On
to the
the
Constitution on
on the
the
Jefferson
Quran.
front, right?
Yeah,
Okay, awesome.
that's
Wow,
right. Yeah,
amazing.
that's
Yeah,
right.
that's amazing. Well, Professor, we are actually coming to the last quarter of our episode here. So, with your permission, I'm going to confess one thing, and that is that before we started the episode, I actually solicited a couple of questions from other people just to bring some more diversity to the discussion, and it wasn't a part of the list that I had shared with you earlier. So, with your permission, I would like to read out a guest question for you. And would you like to take a guess as to
Go
who it
ahead.
could be from?
Oh wow, I have no idea.
All right. So
Tell me.
well, I hope this will come as a surprise. It's none other than Dr. Akbar Ahmed himself, your mentor and your professor. And
Wow.
we got in
Oh
touch
my
with him
gosh.
before the episode, and he was really nice enough to send in a question. And admittedly, I have to make another confession. When you put up his tweet on Twitter, that is when I made the connection between Dr. Akbar Ahmed and the person I used to see on CNN and the BBC right after 9/11 as the face of the moderate Muslim, as the scholarly face of Islam. So I had no idea until just 2 weeks back when you happened
He's
to
the
share
man.
that
Yeah,
tweet. And
he's amazing. Yeah,
he's an amazing man. Yes, absolutely.
he
And
is.
absolutely. And okay, so with your permission, let me just read out the question that Dr. Akbar had sent, and I'm just reading it verbatim. Dear Craig, as your former professor, I am so proud of what you have achieved and how much you have achieved. You have become a true bridge between different world cultures. My question to you is, have you personally presented your book to the Honorable Pope in Rome? As he is one of the greatest spiritual leaders of our time, I am sure he will be delighted to know that there are young warriors for peace in our world, especially with your American and Irish Italian background. I will continue to bask in your glory. Yours truly, Dr. Akbar Ahmed. So there you go.
Wow, that's amazing. That made my day. That was awesome. A couple things here. When Pope Francis became Pope, Dr. Ahmed and I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post. And Dr. Ahmed just reiterated my faith in Pope Francis, because Pope Francis was talking about really what Dr. Ahmed has always talked about. Mm-hmm. In light of this interfaith realm, Pope Francis used the term culture of encounter, and like that's what Dr. Ahmed gave me. He didn't teach it to me. He gave it to me. He brought me around my own country for a year, and he opened, people opened doors for him, but he was opening doors for me. So everyone was opening doors for each other. Mm-hmm. And I was able to encounter humanity. And that to me was just incredible. So I knew Dr. Omar was a big fan of Pope Francis right when Pope Francis came in. And then Pope Francis gave me something that I had never had before, which is like a completely new way of being Catholic. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't necessarily about doctrine or dogma. It was about the culture of encounter, how you live, how you treat people. So Pope Francis gave me a different identity in being a proud Catholic. Dr. Ahmed earlier gave me the scholarly hat, the knowledge. Now, I mean, I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Ahmed. Now, with Pope Francis, People of the Book, Omar, that book that you have right there, is dedicated to Pope Francis. Mm-hmm. And I talk about Pope Francis in the introduction. I have yet to meet Pope Francis. I do not believe he has a copy of the book. However, when I was recently in Abu Dhabi at the Abrahamic Family House, I met his former secretary who inaugurated the St. Francis Church at the Abrahamic Family House, and we exchanged information. And the former secretary was basically like, yeah, send the book. But it's one of those things like you don't really take it seriously. Like the Pope isn't going to get my book, right? Like that's what I'm thinking. Like, why? It's going to cost me $30 to send it, and it's probably never going to get there. But I hope to God I can meet Pope Francis. Honestly, like I'm concerned that he might be the only Pope in my life that would even want to meet with me. Because we have so much in common, and who knows what's going to happen with the next pope. I mean, it could be someone totally different, Mm-hmm. But these are my role models. I mean, these are my role models: Dr. Ahmed, Pope Francis, and so many other people. And the common theme behind all of these role models is it's not really what they believe in terms of like traditional religious belief. It's not that. It's really like how you conduct yourself, how you live, what you hope to get out of life, how you treat others. I mean, that's what it's all about for me.
Absolutely. And we will hope that if His Eminence Pope Francis is watching, that he will have some of his people, reach out to you for a change and try and get the book. And I have to just confess my own admiration for Pope Francis, because we've seen him for the last 10 years. I think that whatever he says really resonates with the Muslim world as well. And he could not have picked a better regal name, because obviously he's named himself after Saint Francis of Assisi, who who is such a revered figure in Catholicism. And of course, I've had a lot of friends who've also taken to the Franciscan way of life, and so it's really great to know more about the Pope. Okay, so Professor, I know that we're just about coming towards the end of the episode, but what I'll do is I'll just ask you just 2 or 3 more questions, and please feel free to answer it as briefly as you'd like. I do have one more guest question, and the second guest question that I have for you is from Mr. Julian Bond, who was actually one of the people who made, who did a review of your book. And Julian is actually an old friend of mine. We've been friends for the last 12 to 13 years. We've collaborated a lot. He was the ex-director. Small world, yeah. He was the ex-director of the Christian Muslim Forum in the UK, and we've kept in touch for the last 10, 12 years. And so the question that Julian Bond has for you is, Dear Craig, I have 2 questions. Firstly, what would Muhammad and Jesus say to each other if they met? And secondly, where is my copy of the book?
All right. So the first one, what would they say? I think their first reaction would be a big embrace,
Mhm.
um, and a very warm, cordial kind of thumbs up. And then I think maybe 10, 15 minutes into it, they might kind of go like this a little bit and be like, what have our people done? What have our people done? What are they doing? I think they'd be concerned.
Mhm.
They're obviously they'd be hopeful, right? They wouldn't, they wouldn't lose hope. Hope is a divine element. It comes from outside of ourselves. So like they wouldn't not have hope,
Mhm.
but I think they would be concerned at the state of things at a very big picture. Now Julian's book. Oh
Mhm.
my God. I feel like I think I never sent it. I must have never sent it to him, which is terrible. I feel horrible because the book came out years ago.
Right.
And like honestly, I tell people I have a very small group of people around me helping me, and I
Mhm.
tell them to do things. And this is very unfortunate. I feel horrible. Tell Julian if you contact him before I do, we
Mhm.
need to get his address. I
Okay.
need to send him that book. I'm going to send him like probably four other books too to make up for it. I
Oh,
apologize.
oh, not a problem. Well, I'm sure Julian won't mind because I think he's got such a big heart and he's one of the nicest human beings I've met. And I really take my hat off to him for all the interfaith work that he has done over the years. And just in order to get onto his good side, if in case he's a bit cross about this, you know how a lot of people mix up the English and the Irish. People tend to make a bigger mistake with the English and the Welsh, and he's a very proud Welshman. So maybe that's the way to
Oh,
say
is he?
going back into
I didn't I
this.
didn't know that. Well, I get he's joking. I
Right.
know he's
He's
joking,
joking.
but he's not. It's that little I can see the Welsh and the Irish humor being kind of
Right.
a little bit similar,
Hmm.
but
Absolutely.
yeah, I know what he's saying.
Okay. All right. So, Professor, very quickly, I'm going to ask you another question, which is actually a staple question, that we have on the show here. And the question to you, one of our staple questions for the show, because we're, after all, a podcast about books, is if you could select a book that you feel that every, let's say, young person should read at least once in their lifetime, it doesn't have to be related to your field of study, but if you could select a book that you feel that everybody should read at least once in their life, what would be that book that you would select?
Wow, that is a monstrous, monstrous question. So one book, it can only be one book.
Well, you can have two or three, whatever you feel like, no problem. I have to admit that every one of my guests so far have told me how hard this question is, but I'm really hoping
Yeah,
that
it's impossible.
yeah, it's a really
I
hard
mean, I,
question.
I would I would say if I had to choose one, from my perspective, it would be the Bible.
Mhm.
But before that person started reading, I would want to sit down with that person and say, "This is why I think you should read this."
Mhm.
And I would explain to them, I would give them a frame of reference before they entered into that.
Mhm.
Because I do think you can explore knowledge through the Bible.
Mhm.
There's no doubt. But I also think that you can do it through other texts, other sacred texts as well, right? So like I don't think it's cut off. I don't think it's exclusionary. Um, but that's what I would say. I would say the Bible. Lots of lessons. It's a long read. You
Mhm.
better dedicate a couple of empty weeks
Yeah.
and there's some boring stuff in there. There's a lot of history, but
Would that be
that's
the
what that's
RCV, the Roman Catholic version by any chance? The version of the
yes. So
Bible?
the one I have is the one I was given when I was 8. It's the Good News
Good
Bible.
News Bible. Okay.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's still in print, but this thing is like falling apart. It's
Mhm.
so old, but it's so that's what I would say. But
Yeah.
I it's important the context that I put it in. Like I'm not telling someone to read the Bible because they need to believe in Jesus or else they're going to hell. Like no way. You know that. I would never say something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah. there's a lot of good stuff in there, and that's what I would say. Now, if I could drop maybe two or three more
Sure,
really good
sure.
books.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, wow. 1984
George
by
Orwell.
George by
Mm,
George Orwell.
mm.
Um, there was a book called The Words That Lincoln Lived By. I don't know who it was. It was a collection of Lincoln's quotes. Um, one of the books, Omar, that I actually disagree with the most had a huge impact on me, and I think I need to mention it. Samuel Huntington's The Clash of
Clash of
Civilizations.
Civilizations, right? And
You
you've
know,
name
like
dropped Luke in the book. Yeah,
so even though like I don't agree with him,
hmm,
he helped me to think about the world.
correct.
Um, so I could go on and on. I mean, some of them are probably behind me here, but I will say this: I'm not a big fan of fiction.
Mm.
I'm
Okay.
not a big fan of fiction at all. Like it's hard. I can do like a historical narrative type book
Mm.
that's like semi-fiction, but
Although 1984, to be fair, is does fall under fiction though.
it is definitely fiction. But I like Orwell, not necessarily because of um the points that he's making at a big picture, but I like the simplicity
Mm.
of his writing.
Right. Absolutely.
Um, so if I had to choose one fiction book, that's what it would
That
be.
would be the one.
And
Right.
there's not many behind it in terms of fiction. But
Yeah,
that's
for
just
sure.
me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I actually happen to be a fan of his other book, Animal Farm. I just
Yes.
find it to be really cleverly written, and it's a book for its time, and of course, 1984. Okay, so Professor, I want to be respectful of your time because we did promise that we'll cut it off. We'll make a hard cut after an hour. So once again, for our viewers and listeners who are watching us on YouTube, do please be sure to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being with us all this time. And again, if you found us on Apple, Google, or Spotify, do please continue to download. The book, once again, is The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View by Professor Dr. Craig Considine. Please go out and buy it. It's a fantastic book written by a fantastic scholar. And we really hope to have Dr. Constantine back for a future episode, perhaps to talk about people of the book. And, we would love to, continue this discussion and maybe have a part two as well. So, Professor, just one last question. If your fans and readers want to stay in touch with your activities, what would be the best way to do so?
So I'm most active on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I do post on YouTube. My email is readily available at the Rice University website. So I use all forms of communication. So if someone needs to reach me, they can easily find me.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's wonderful to hear. So, Professor, I just want to take this opportunity to thank you once again for doing this. As I mentioned that I was really worried about the internet connection just before we started the episode. It just happens
We
to be
did it.
episode 13, but yeah, but I believe that you
That's
really brought
right.
the luck of the Irish to counteract all the bad luck that might have, it could have been a
Yes.
disastrous episode, but yeah, thank
I,
you so
I
much
have
once again.
a little Irish flag here. I don't think you can see it. There it is. It says Irish.
Okay, the Irish
So
flag.
there it is. It's hanging over my head for us.
Okay. I was wondering if it was the tricolor or the Union Jack, because of the difference between the Irish Republic and
Yes, yeah.
Ireland.
We can have a podcast on that too if you want.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Professor, thank you once again. You've been a wonderful guest. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I really mean what I said, that I really do hope to have you back for a future episode, inshallah, God willing, whenever you have time on your hands. So, thank you once again. It's been
Omar,
a pleasure.
and thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for your continued support, your warm words, also your words of wisdom. Thank you for reaching out to Dr. Ahmed, and I look forward to future engagements with you, my friend. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a nice day. And
You too. Thank you.